west. Santa Fe, yes, same Santa Fe is there, will be the capital of what they called New Mexico. The thing is, not very many Spanish moved to the area. If we look at what is today, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, is there much of a reason to go there for natural resources? Yes, desert. Now later on, silver would be found in Nevada, and actually they didn't know that gold was in California, and that's part of it. Except for California, is that very good agricultural land?
Yeah.
Except for California. Arizona, New Mexico, big, right? So that's why you kind of look at the Spanish, there wasn't a whole lot. So they established some of the areas, but for the most part, there weren't many Spanish that went there.
From Friday, why did the Spanish establish the towns in Florida?
All right, why for all of this, going back to that for Friday, whether it be St. Augustine, Pensacola, or where they had a whole bunch of little missions around, what are they worried about?
The French?
Yeah, the French, and then the missions would be there once the English started settling. But it was actually the French. They didn't want the French stealing their gold and silver that's coming up the Gulf Stream there. So it's pretty much Florida was a military institution to protect what they have. And the Spanish in 250 years did hardly anything to make Florida better. We will find that English take over, and in 20 years the English do more than what the Spanish did in 250 years. All right, out west, one thing that we have, we'll find that the Spanish are very harsh to the Native Americans that are out there. And we will have, and the reason why I point this one out there, and I don't have every single Indian war because we could spend the entire semester on Indian wars, but we'll have the Pueblo Rebellion, which was started and led by the Indian leader Pope. Now, what happens with this is, and which it happens over and over again, whether we're talking about the Spanish or the English or the Americans later on. Pope would lead, they would then defeat the Spanish. What did the Spanish then do?
Send more.
Yeah, send more. And send a bigger army, and ultimately this is where, and this again is a repeating history that we will have, English will go with it, and then the Americans too. But this kind of shows that for the Indians, and even though the Spanish tried to do some things to Christianize them, it was one of those things that what if they didn't want to be Christian? What Christian thing did the Spanish do to them?
Kill them.
Yeah, kill them. Okay, so this is where you look. And the Spanish were not known to be the nicest to them in here. Now, California. California has a string of missions that are kind of famous in there. The reason why the Spanish started to establish them is because the Russians were coming from the north where they owned Alaska and were starting to come down the coast and claim it. So California was kind of like how the Spanish had Florida. It was supposed to be pretty much a buffer and a military outpost to protect Mexico from, in this case, the Russians, where Florida was originally against the French, and then the English. All right, the French. Now in Florida, we will have a very short time in Jacksonville, a small Huguenot colony, but it will be quickly defeated by Pedro Melendez. For most of the French in North America, though, they will settle in what today is Canada, especially along the St. Lawrence Seaway and down the Mississippi River. Some of you that know your Catholic universities, Marquette, LaSalle, Joliet. All right, a lot of our Catholic universities we have in America today are named after the French explorers that came through here. But this graph kind of tells one thing that is a big difference that we will have. Even though the French have a lot more area, this graph kind of gives a representation of the population. The English have a small area along the coast. The French have that big area, but who has more people?
English.
Yeah, the English. And that will later on play into why the English will end up taking over them. But for the French, how did they make their money? What was? All right, what?
The furs.
Yeah, the furs. And one thing about the furs, where'd they get the furs from? Yeah, the Indians, and then Canada, but also if you're trading with the Indians and that's your main source of income, what's your relationship going to be with them?
Nice.
Yeah, it was very cordial, very nice. And not only was it a nice trading relationship because, yeah, they're making money off of them, but the French will actually even allow, in the very beginning, intermarrying between the French and the Indians. Pretty much seeing them almost as equal. Where the English, yeah, there was some, but not a whole lot that took place of that. For the Spanish, for the people that were ruling, it wasn't really allowed. So this is where you will have this on it. And I had this question, how was their treatment of Native Americans different from other Europeans? They were, when we kind of break it and make it simple, they had the best relationship and their treatment with the other Native Americans. And again, it comes down to their trading in furs and the race that they had. Now, for the impact later on, guess which side most of the Native Americans fought on when the French and British will fight each other? Yeah, most of them come to the French side then because of that. Not all, there were a few that the British were able to get, most of them are there. All right, now we get to the Dutch. Remember, Netherlands was one of the top 5. The Dutch, what they established in the area that today would be part of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, but mainly New York, they will establish trading communities. They are called patroons. That's an SFI you've got to know. When you see that, you're thinking of Dutch. All right, you're thinking of the Netherlands, and you got to think of that. That's a trading line. Their biggest trading platoon that they set up was this place called New Amsterdam. It was at the mouth of the Hudson River. What city is that today?
New York.
Yeah, it's New York City. But New Amsterdam would be. They called their area New Netherlands. Okay, original name there with it. Again, that is now New York. The reason why it's called New York is the British would take over it, and the general that was in charge of the British army that defeated the Dutch was James, the Duke of York. So when he won, he renamed it after his home that he was from, which was in York, England. So that's why it's called New York. New Amsterdam becomes New York City. There. Port Orange becomes Albany, the capital of the state of New York. And this is where we will have, I have on here many financial ideas start there. That is where Wall Street actually starts, where they are starting to trade with it. Today we do it by decimals, but until about 15 years ago when you traded stocks, it was that you would actually, when you bought shares of stocks, it would be either an eighth, a quarter, all right, and as a fractions. And the reason why they did that is, and this goes to the background of the Spanish with the pieces of 8 of gold. The reason why they're pieces of 8, you could break up the coins into 8 different pieces like a pie as parts of a coin. And when they bought and sold stocks, it might be 3 and an 8. Today, again, we kind of gone for decimals because that makes it a lot easier to go with things instead of, because for you all thinking an eighth, oh my, that's too much math. Okay, and how many eighths go into 3/4 and all that. But this were for the Dutch. For a short time, they were pretty powerful, but they are taken over by the English in there. I have the question: how was the treatment of the Native Americans by the Dutch?
Nice.
No, not so nice.
It really wasn't that nice. And even though one of the things they did trade for was furs, here's where they did not think of them as equals. One of the famous stories, right here, again, stand in the back here. You gonna drift off again here? All right. I don't want you to be like last Thursday when you were barely alive. But this is where we have for one of the famous stories. The Indians bought Manhattan, or the Dutch bought Manhattan Island from the Indians for $24 in trinkets. Like, trinkets are little toys and mirrors and stuff like that. So we have a box of little toys. Here, can you give us Manhattan Island? Which you probably can't even buy too many a hamburger or anything for $24 on Manhattan today. But this is where, now, one thing that you have to kind of look at this. What was the idea of land ownership for Native Americans? Who owned the land?
Nobody.
Yeah, nobody. Right, it belonged to the Great Spirit. And as humans, you are put on earth to take care of the Great Spirit. And you are not to abuse what the Great Spirit has. So when Europeans came, this is going to be something that happens over and over again, and they say, well, here, we're going to buy this from you. Did they understand buying land? They thought of it, hey, you gave us, look at all these nice little things. Oh, I got a mirror. So, but then what would happen when the Indians would come back to an area that the English, Dutch, Swedish thought that they had bought from them? What did the English do when they came back on the land that, wait, you sold this to us?
I killed them all.
Yeah, this is where we'll have our conflicts. And this is, Native Americans didn't have this same idea along the way. Now we come to the greatest group of all, the Swedish, and the great impact that they had on America, even though they're only here for a few decades. Understand that. But the Swedish, now it was Finnish also, but hey, we don't want, that's like your ugly cousin, you ignore them. But for the Swedish, they come to America, settle a very small area on what would be New Jersey. But they bring with them something that is seen as very American, the log cabin. We're watching American Story of Us along the way. Somewhere along the line, I know they use this phrase, that the log cabin was like the first mobile home for Americans. Anyone know what they're thinking of there?
They can
You
take
just
it
cut
apart.
the tree wherever you go.
Well, is a log cabin, and look at this, is that a great home?
No, not really.
But is it a home?
Yeah.
Is it yours?
Yeah.
And this is where we can kind of go back, and what is the American dream? For many people, it's the American dream to have their own home. And this is part of what you would have. Would you rather own your own home, whether it be a mobile home, a log cabin, than have to pay a landlord and own someone else? And this is why it's kind of seen as it might be a stepping stone for some people, it might be, but at least it's yours. It's not someone else's. Here that we have. And is it something that is quick and a little bit easier to make? Now, the reason for the Swedish that they had this is the British, when they came over, and I'll come back to you in a second here. The British, when they built their house, they would put a frame, they would put this like cloth, and then they would make this plaster and this mud, which looks nicer, but when it was cold, these logs, and it's like Lincoln Logs, where you can go, and I could go with you all, we could go out to the state forest, and we could build a log cabin. It may not be that great,
Good field trip.
but we could. No.
Let's do
Like,
it.
you all would like to work with
Yeah,
money.
we can call it
How much
new
would
steps.
you all want you to be hauling logs around?
We can call it new steps, Mr. Beck.
But you put it together like Lincoln Logs, you put mud in the cracks. Where some of because it won't fit flat, although you try to shape it to make it as flat, but there's some that you won't have in there. But if it was cold, like our great winter freeze that we had last week, that one day when it got below 32. But when it's cold, will those logs provide more insulation than basically a woven thing with some mud plaster on the side of it? In America, whether it be today or especially 400 years ago, did we have a lot of logs?
Yeah.
So it was readily available. You could build this faster in an auction. It was better than most of what the British were making, because normal people couldn't have a stone cutter come in and build them a nice stone house. So that is where it does make it, and what is seen as the American idea for the log cabin is brought by the Swedish. But the Swedish were quickly taken over by the Dutch, and the Dutch were taken over by the English. But we do have that background. All right, what was your question? Or
Wait. So whenever the English came over and stuff, they weren't making log houses, they were just using like tents?
No, well, in the
Like
beginning, but yeah, what you would do, you would actually think of like long, I call it the broom sage, and you kind of weave it together to make some sort of cloth. And then you mix together almost like a cement plaster that you would put on the outside there, because you would build the frames on the shop. So it maybe looked better, but it actually wasn't as good as even a log cabin. If the log cabin was made right. See, you pick the straight trees, right? And there's certain things you must do. The ones that are a little bit bigger are lower, and as you kind of get a little bit smaller when you go up. The hardest thing to build for a log cabin is the roof. But what's the hardest thing to build on other houses? The roof. So, I mean, you still took the engineering there. It wasn't really that bad, but they were such a small group it didn't make a huge difference. Yeah, it wasn't a long-term impact. And part of that, again, we don't know what if more of them would come. The relationship didn't turn bad, but there was, again, it was a small enough group of Swedish, Finnish people that came. So That's why, yeah, they're there. And no, I'm not just doing the Swedish because I'm Swedish. They actually, the log cabin is the main thing that you have on there. Sorry, you're not the first one to say that today. On there. Yeah. Yeah. All right, this map is kind of showing when we get to a point, basically in the mid-1600s, where you have the British along the seaboard, but you have the Dutch kind of breaking them up. But what happens to the Dutch? Yeah, they're taken over by the British. Meanwhile, we have the Spanish in Florida, the Spanish out west, mixed settlement because it's some Spanish, a little bit of French, some Russian that are coming there. And then you look at this area, Indian Reserve. So we left something for the Indians, but did everybody really think they should deserve all this land?
No.
So guess where we're going to have a war over later on in history?
That area.
That area. The French and Indian War will be over that area, as the French and the British are claiming that. All right, early British explorers. So now we get to the early part here. Sir Francis Drake, in English history and lore. Oh, what a great guy. He's a pirate. Queen Elizabeth knights him as a sir because he keeps bringing her gold and silver. Where does he get the gold and silver from?
The French.
Yeah, the Spanish. He is robbing the Spanish ships out of the sea and then coming back to the English, and then basically Queen Elizabeth let him hide out his ships there. Eventually the Spanish would not be real happy with that there. I'll come back to them. But then we have John Cabot. Early on for the English looking for the Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage is this mythical water route over what today would be the top of Canada that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. Why do I keep saying mythical? Well, there's water there. Why can't you get through it?
It's all ice.
It's all ice, except for it maybe isn't mythical. We have actually had some ships now that can go across the Northwest Passage.
Now
we can, and this is where, as the Arctic, at certain times in the summer, has become basically in some of those areas, if you have it has become so thin, and enough of the ice has been melted away there, but not quite for normal ships to go through it yet. Now, the Spanish Armada. The Spanish got ticked off at what the English were doing. 1588, they send the greatest navy in the history of the world to go crush the English. And the English win. How did the English defeat the mighty Spanish Armada?
Natural disaster.
A natural disaster? What'd you say? They had faster ships? No. Although there was actually, you are right for some things. The first part of it they did when the Spanish first came, and they weren't in a true formation because they took the English too lightly. They were able to bring up actually not even true ships and come up and shoot. So the Spanish regrouped, but when they regrouped, that is where there was a natural disaster, and it destroys part of the Spanish Armada. So the Armada goes back to Spain to kind of regroup and rebuild, but it saves the English, but it does give the English a time then in history to not be crushed by them, and they will then start their exploration. It actually started a little before that with the first group they have. Our first English colony is at Roanoke. Now here's where it's more interesting trivia. They do not have a lasting impact on history. This is all trivia, but sometimes for some of you to know the history of it. Roanoke is basically on the coast, real close to where the Virginia, North Carolina border is, on an island. It is nicknamed the Lost Colony. We have found where it was now, but no. It was founded in 1587. When was the Spanish Armada defeated? 1588, so a year later, but that comes into it. The first explorers came, they dropped off a group of people. They went back to England to get supplies. When they got back to England, they weren't allowed to leave because that ship was recruited to fight the Spanish Armada. After the Armada was defeated, they come back and found an empty village. Now before they left, we do have one piece of trivia that you have, and here is trivia upon trivia. The first English woman that was born, the first English baby was born, Virginia Dare. She died. Yeah.
Virginia
Now-
was born there.
Virginia Dare.
Now, first of all, the name Virginia, which the colony of Virginia name. Anyone know where that name comes from?
Virginia Dare.
No. She's even named Queen Elizabeth,
Oh, that makes sense.
Virgin Queen.
the Virgin Queen. So that is why, where she was known as the Virgin Queen, that is where Virginia is named after, and the first English-born person. Again, that is trivia for it. But with what would happen to it, when the ships got back to where Roanoke was, the village was empty. We have carved into a tree. See, they took that picture at that time, kept it on their phone. But they had carved into a tree and carved above one of the doorposts the word Croatan. C-R-O-T-A-N.
Good Indian.
When they got there, they knew it was an Indian tribe. Now the question is, did they go and peacefully live with those Indian tribe, or did that Indian tribe attack them?
But ate them.
So you don't know what it is, but they didn't stick around because a storm was coming up, and what would actually today we would know would be like a hurricane was about to approach. They knew what the signs of it. Their ship was basically up into this, not a safe harbor, but harbor. Have you ever seen pictures after a hurricane where ships have been thrown up on the shoreline? If you are at that time and your only way back to England is that ship, you go and ride out the storm. You go out to the ocean, and yes, there are big waves, but you ride it out because that is your only way back. Otherwise, you're not a ship builder. You can't build a ship good enough to go. So they said, we hope they're with those Indians, and they left and never came back. And we don't know whatever happened to them. That's why they are the lost colony.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
They're like fully English.
Yeah, she was fully English, and I really don't know what happened to her. I think she ended up disappearing with all the rest of them. But before that is when they came. Like,
Weren't there instances of English settlers finding Indians with like blue eyes and stuff?
and there was, and this is where for some things, and this is where for English fishermen for a while were fishing, and they would do trading along the coast. So it could be. Do you think there might have been some contact there? And this is what, or you could go for different languages or some religion and ideas that did all other things. You can go with aliens, but let's not go there.
So Croatan, whatever, is that like the name of the tribe?
It's the name of the tribe. It's the only clue that we have.
Okay.
And the whole scheme of things, do they really matter?
Yes.
What did that tribe do?
They made the first baby.
Yeah. What did that mean?
Virginia.
Said all of that is trivia. It makes for a nice story. So sometimes there. But now we have not the first one, but the one that made the lasting impress, though.
I'm so
Is that G?
Right, and that's where this one comes in. All right, Virginia Company, London Company. Today we would call this a corporation. In those days they were called a joint stock company. People would basically invest in the company. The idea is to make money, and as it makes money, you get the more that you own of the company, you get dividends back. So they invested in this company. People went off and they were trying to make money. And what were they looking for?
Gold.
Yeah, gold. Some of you know that great historical movie made by Disney called Pocahontas. And people got off the ship and sung as they would dig. As you know, if you spend hours and hours digging, it makes you want to sing and dance with your shovel. But that is where they're looking for gold. Except for, did they find gold in Virginia?
No.
No, they kept looking, and that part of Pocahontas is true. They kept looking for it. Meanwhile, there was this guy by the name of John Smith, who was exploring the area, trying to find if their area that they needed to prospect. He quickly figured out there's not gold, but he came into a relation with this Indian by the name of Powhatan, who was the head of the Powhatan tribe. And he was then able to work out deals and trade with them for stuff like that they needed, such as food. Now, he did probably sometime meet his daughter, who was what? Famous person? Pocahontas.
Wait.
That Pocahontas, of
So
course.
John Smith is Pocahontas' dad.
No, it's not his dad.
I'm so
Powhatan.
confused.
Powhatan is Pocahontas' dad. Now,
Oh.
we do not know if, and we don't even know for sure if John Smith actually met Pocahontas or that. His relationship was with her dad. But you remember the story of Juan Ortez. the English then later on will make that story of Juan Ortez. Now, what is true, which this part is actually in Pocahontas 2. All right, yes, there is a Pocahontas 2, and we're straight to video. And Pocahontas will be important. But for the original Pocahontas, Disney had to fudge a little bit on this because Pocahontas would probably have been not even quite 10 years old, and John Smith closer to 30. All right, you don't make those type of movies. Plus, they were true. Did they ever kiss?
I mean,
She's a
yeah.
little
No.
The second movie.
The second movie, but it's not John. It's not John Smith.
It's John Rolfe.
It's John Rolfe, and that's where it'll be different. Which John Smith does get hurt. He leaves. Now, for those of you that are saying, wait, there's got to be a love story, John Smith will come back and explore up and down the North American coast and never come back and see Pocahontas. So,
That's what he was looking for.
meanwhile, in Jamestown, they will have the starving time, which they have a hard time surviving without the food. John Smith was their main connection, and the Indians by now are figuring out that they are dying a lot. There's something wrong with these English. Whenever the English came out of their fort, they would attack them. The fort was not made in a very good place. It was strategically made so in case the Spanish come, if you see it is kind of shaped like a triangle where you could put your cannons to shoot a Spanish ship, and the Spanish ship had to come in one direction. Problem is, the fort's pretty much made in a swamp. Which meant the water they were drinking was not very good, which helped make even more diseases that they have there. But over 3/4 of those English would die. Finally, a ship would come with more survivors. And there, but one person that was, not survivors, but people to help him out, was this guy by the name of John Rolfe. And he would have with him seeds of something the Spanish were hiding, and it would be known as the brown gold, and would give something that the Virginia Company or London Company would be able to use. What was brown gold that made money for Jamestown? Not- It is tobacco. And thank you. Usually we have someone yell marijuana, but no, it is tobacco. What was grown? And the Virginia Company would make some money for a while, but eventually the Virginia Company would become bankrupt. By the way, John Rolfe will marry Pocahontas, and it sounds like a nice story. She is kind of seen as a princess, is brought over to London. She is not dressed as Disney would dress her. She actually dressed in Elizabethan type attire, but she will catch a disease and die in London. I know in the movie she climbs the steeple and sings on the top of the steeple.
And then she runs.
Yes, that is. And that is the real story, is after she marries John Rolfe, not John Smith.
Told you STDs was going on.
John Smith, pretty much he helped get food for Jamestown and helped them out for a little bit, but then he gets injured and leaves. And when he's gone, he's not there. So in the whole scheme of things, John Smith isn't long term, as in not very important. John Rolfe is.
Did Pocahontas take another Indian with her to London?
I don't know.
Was he really tall and big and awesome?
Was he like a brick?
Alright, here's where we have one other word that you need to know. The Virginia Company would eventually go bankrupt, and then Virginia would then become a royal colony.
What does that mean?
Okay, what is a royal colony?
A colony owned by the British.
Owned by the king or queen. It is owned by royalty. By the way, with the names, Jamestown is named after King James. And for those of you that know with religion, the King James Bible, and this is after the back and forth with Protestant Catholicism, he wants to make sure that the English, with the Anglican Church, they have a Bible in English, where the Catholic Church used the Latin Bible. So that is why we have the King James Version of the Bible, where he had people then go and make it into.
Wait.
We needed someplace to put it.
Although the Virginia Company failed, how did it change the course of history?
That was
Okay, what did they bring? Or what was brought there?
Brown gold.
Tobacco. And here's where you kind of look long term. Guess what? Separatists, the Puritans were different. They wanted to purify the church. They weren't going to completely separate it. John Winthrop is the Puritans' leader. City Upon the Hill is his book where he wrote about they came and they were making a utopia. So then you have different religious groups that they feel like their way is what it should be. And that is what Boston was supposed to be the city upon a hill, a model for the rest of the world to follow. Now, for the Puritan, everything is based upon religion. Your family idea was patriarchal. The father was in charge. Mother did not have much to do. We will have Harvard established, the first college, and it was to train preachers. There. The idea of the Puritan work ethic. Everything you are doing is supposed to be for God. So if you are not working hard, then you're going to be doing something that isn't for God. And that's where that saying, idle hands are the devil's work, that comes from it there. Based upon the predestination idea. What was predestination?
Like it determined the future.
Yeah, determined already beforehand. So again, 3% were the saints on there. Now I say, what is the problem with that?
Everybody allowed their 3%.
Yeah, if you didn't think you were part of that 3%, or what about people that moved in if you weren't part of that religion? We did not have where, for the Puritans, the idea of conversion, which this is what's going to come up here in a second with it. And again, yesterday I know I have the halfway covenant on here, and I kind of went through. Don't try to get too deep into this here, but this is where the Puritans realized they were losing their power, because as more and more people were moving in. And then some of the thing was, if you have more and more of these people that aren't part of the church, and it might be a lot more fun instead of going to the basic church here and you're doing a Bible study to hang out with some of those other people that are doing things that are a lot more fun. So they were trying to convert some of the non-believers to come in there, but instead of being converted, their children were allowed to be baptized, and then their children could be trained in the church. Again, it comes down to power here that they have. All right, people that you need to know them. Roger Williams. Roger Williams will write Liberty of Conscience, which in this case he is criticizing the fact that government is making the rules. Should the preacher be the one that is not only making the rules, but judges you? I mean, I don't know what the biggest church is in Inverness. I would think it would be either First Baptist or Cornerstone, or the Catholic Church actually probably is the largest in population. But do you all live the life that those ministers hopefully expect you to live? Or do you maybe fall short in some ways of what should be done? And this is where, and even though Roger Williams, now he is not against religion. And one thing with the liberty of conscience he also has is he starts to have this idea of a conversion there. And we will have Ann Hutchinson come with there. The biggest thing that liberty of conscience he said is that government and church should be separate. Do we have that in American government today?
Mm-hmm.
Separation of church and state. And this is where early on. Now, a lot of the leaders in the church did not like him. He was seen as a dissenter. He wasn't truly kicked out, but he pretty much was being kicked out. He went to Rhode Island. When he went to Rhode Island, he then started, and now he's in charge of his own colony. He does separate church and state, where he could have been the leader. One other thing that he does different, and this might seem a lot more like Christian-like than what the Puritans had, because the Puritans will go and try to eliminate and kill off the Indians. He goes and he works out a working relationship with the Indians that live on Rhode Island. So a lot of the Christian ideals of Rhode Island. Meanwhile, we will have Ann Hutchinson. Ann Hutchinson was a good Puritan woman. I can't remember offhand exactly how many children she had there, but it was somewhere, for some reason I'm thinking it was like 17, 18 children. When I say a good Puritan woman, you're supposed to have children, one after another. Why is it that in a lot of religions, that's what there was, like even up until a couple decades ago, if you were a good Catholic, you would have a lot of children. What was the reason for having a lot of children? Well, part of it was to work on the farm. That's your retirement. The other thing, yeah, more people for the church. The church will continue to grow. She was also a person that was a spiritual leader. She would have women that she came in and she preached to, but there was one other problem. She also preached to men. Could a woman be the spiritual leader of a man? According to the Puritan men that were leaders, no, they are not to. And this is where she also, the idea of free will, conversion, the idea that you're not predestined. And this is where antinomialism comes into it. You have it. You can make a conscious decision in here. Today, for a lot of you in Protestant churches, the idea that you can be saved. You can have that conversion experience there. It is not predestined there. So even if you were where you were a sinner before, all right, the sins can be washed away then from you with your conversion. But this is where the Puritan leaders, this is something that's different. She preached to men, and she will end up moving. All right, no, she does not shack up with Roger Williams, okay, out there, but she moves to Rhode Island, and she then is able to go and practice in the way that she had. What's kind of into a sad story, I cannot remember exactly how. This is where I learned in the People Reports by whoever had Ann Hutchinson last year. She ultimately, her and a bunch of her children got killed by the Indians. They ended up moving to New York later on, I think, and then but that's where she ended up being killed. And many of her children with her were killed by the Indians at that time. But both Roger Williams and Ann Hutchinson, these are dissenters. They go against what the Puritans have, and they're pretty much kicked out. All right. We will have, and I don't, once again, I do not go with every single Indian war, but this is where we will have for this war in 1637, one of the things, and this is where the Puritans, they will, again, this Christian group will pretty much wipe out the tribe there. And Williams actually will end up helping out with that beforehand, later on doesn't. King Philip's War is another one. But what ends up happening here is they split up the Iroquois, get them fighting against each other, that confederation. It also shows with this new weapon called the flintlock. Those of you that know with guns, we will have two pieces of flint that come together that cause the spark. Where before, the way that the old guns, you remember what the name of it is, you would actually light like a fuse, and then it's like a matchlock or something that will come down, and then that will make a mini explosion with the powder. But the flintlock actually makes it where it is quicker, and then they were also more accurate. But this is where we have these conflicts where as the Puritans are expanding out, the Indians are fighting against them, and we have these wars on the frontier with it. And the overall theme that you have here, the Puritans made little effort to work with the Indians, where sometimes you think of different Christian groups going and being missionaries. That was not their idea that they had for the Puritans with the Indians. They were different. They were not. We will have the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, I know for some of you it's real interesting to have here. You might know the story. We have Tituba. Anyone remember who Tituba is?
Mm-hmm. She was a slave lady who, she would teach the young girls their curses from Barbados or something.
Right. She was a slave from Barbados. Now, realize this is in New England. There was slavery in all of our original 13 colonies. But Tituba was a slave. Barbados, where the Puritans had a lot of colonies, she had been there. She had come back. And the young girls were asking her various things. What ended up happening where it got started were these young girls were seen dancing, and they got in trouble for dancing. Remember, idle hands are the devil's work. Okay, so this is where they got in trouble for dancing. And when they were asked about things, they said, well, it's not our fault, it is Tituba's fault. Okay? And this is where we were cursed a long ways. And this will start, and this is not just at Salem, it will happen in other areas in here, but this will start a bunch of accusations. We will end up having over 150 people that are jailed. We will have 19 people that are hung, one is pressed to death. How
What's
are you
pressed?
pressed to death?
They pile rocks
Stones.
on top of you.
Yeah, you pile stones until you have
Poor
so much
child.
weight on you that you can no longer breathe. if it doesn't crush your ribs, usually you end up suffocating to death.
What's worse, being hung or being pressed?
I don't know, I don't want to find out.
Yeah,
But
probably.
yeah, hanging would be better if your neck does go and snap at that time, because then if your spinal cord is still.
Your neck snaps when you get hung?
If it's done right.
If it's done right, how would you
If it's not done right, then you suffocate to death, and it's a very.
Do you
painful-
die instantly if your neck snaps?
Usually, if the spinal cord is broke, then
Oh.
you do it. Yeah. That's why,
Yeah, 'cause
again,
you're
not to get off topic with here. One of the most humane forms of execution is the guillotine, because when that blade comes down, it's in a split second that the person died. That got a bad name in the French Revolution, and it's really messy. And like in the French Revolution, the baskets got so filled up, and heads were rolling out in the crowd, and the eyes are still moving with nerves. So
Ew.
people don't like that. So. But for the Salem witchcraft trials, now, beside that happening, this is where we have to look at for the history side of this. Why did it happen? And what ends up happening is we have a lot of religious tensions. This pressure, that you have, where you have some people that you're supposed to live this life, but maybe there's these influences you don't want to. The Indian pressure. One of the girls that was involved with this, for her, she had one day come home and her entire family had been killed then by Indians, where they attacked on the frontier. For another girl that was involved in this, she kind of went over to her neighbor's house one day and found that they had all been killed by Indians. So you can imagine if you are a child and you're seeing this death and that threat that you might be killed at any time by this group of people that you have in there. But wealth and jealousy. It is no coincidence that one of the very first women that was accused to be a witch was the wife of the richest man in Salem. Because when she's put to death, now the wealthiest man is a widower and can remarry. And girls, look around at the guys in here, you wouldn't have to marry them. Unfortunately, you're going to be marrying someone at that time that is probably closer to the age of your dad. I know, it's something you just throw up in your mouth, right? Why is it that these great men in here are not who you are looking to marry?
They're poor.
Yeah, they're poor. Do they have their own farm, their own horses, their own cows? Okay. They are living with their family. So you are finding someone that's already established. So, and you might be, and actually for you all, some of you would be kind of getting close to being old maids here, because y'all are 16, 17 years old. All right, you might have already been married by now. All right, you probably should have, or really soon. So that is where, for some of these young girls, well, they accused that. What if you had it where, and this is where for one of the people that got accused, and the guy accused his neighbor of killing his horse. Well, I saw him going down the road, he looked in the direction of me, and he was chanting something, and my horse died the next day. So this is where a lot of these accusations. Again, this happened all up and down this area. It was happening also in Europe, there in this wave that came through, and it was hysteria that what happened. Now, the long-term effect of this here. The church, the power of the church will end up decreasing after this. Because some people kind of look at things and say, what is happening here? But that is where for the Salem witchcraft trials, it is really interesting, and the whole scheme of things for history is not as important here. All right, time for you to wake up here. When you see Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening, this is a religious revival. Now, I was raised in a Baptist church, so I know about revivals. What is a revival? Well, church, but extra long. Yeah, it would be all week long. All right, when you have a revival. You go to church. You get a speaker to come there, and one of the things is you want to revive the soul. All right, get things kicked up, because you know how sometimes it's just the same thing over and over again. Well, that is where you get someone in here. So it's the rebirth of the church. This will also create a lot of our new churches, the Congregational Church, the Baptist Church. Later on, the Methodist Church will spin out of this. So that's actually a lot of our Protestant churches. There are some of our top Protestant churches today will come out of the First Great Awakening. We will have new light preachers, and notice how that's underlined. This is a new set of preachers in there. They will give fire and brimstone sermons. If you've ever gone to a church service and basically you feel like everything you've done is wrong, that is a fire and brimstone service. I grew up in a Baptist church. I have just the name of one of the most famous ones from Jonathan Edwards: "Sinners at the hands of an angry God." That sound like what you want to go to?
Sure.
But this is one where you need to repent. My wife was not raised in the Baptist church, so one time we went to, when we first got married, and went to an independent Baptist church, and she went to one, and it was a fire and brimstone preacher. She didn't know. She was like, "Oh my goodness," there, and she didn't realize it. And I'm like, yeah, well, this is, I mean, that was kind of normal, and I can tell for some of you that you've been in a Baptist church, you've been with a preacher that, at the end of it, that I think we need to sing this hymn one more time, because someone out there needs to repent. All right, that one more time is another 15 minutes later. They're still going on. All right, George Whitefield. He is another. I'm not going with all these, but George Whitefield is another one of these new light preachers. And again, it kind of gets the birth where it is reborn and get kind of sent there. That will be the end for this section.